And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
For over 40 years, the big question surrounding the crop circles is whether they are messages from extraterrestrials or some other higher intelligence, or simply the work of talented land artists who continue to make them to hoax the public. Ever since the revelations of Doug and Dave in 1991, two old guys who claimed they had made them all just to fool the public, many people concluded that it was all one big hoax, a view maintained to the present day. However, there are many factors which cast serious doubt on this assumption that are not well known. In this film, we're going to follow the work of two long-standing crop circle researchers. My name is Gary King, and I've been researching crop circles for 27 years now. Joining me is long-standing researcher Andy Thomas. He's an author and has over 30 years' experience working with the crop circles. Together, we both make what we consider to be a compelling argument which clearly articulates the major flaws in the man-made explanation. We ask you to consider the question, why has the mainstream narrative been so heavily biased toward only one side of the argument? Talk of media bias and government deception involving the shadowy world of the intelligence services, such as the CIA and MI5, are part and parcel of the UFO research arena. But we now live in times where government interference and media manipulation in public life are openly admitted. Since the New York Times published their first article back in 2017 on the Pentagon Papers, UFOs are now openly being discussed, and governments around the world are slowly opening their vaults to what has been considered top secret material. In many quarters, academics have finally been given permission to discuss this topic without fear of ridicule, such as Dr. Gary Nolan. He gave an amazing interview with Tucker Carlson, where he openly revealed that the CIA had approached him to do biological research on people who have had close encounters with UFOs, and he has conclusive evidence that in some cases people have suffered serious after effects similar to radiation exposure. Since then, he has gone on to give numerous interviews, and some of the information he has discussed is quite frankly mind-blowing. All of this, together with the media bias, begs the question, has the whole man-made explanation for crop circles been another sophisticated debunking campaign designed to distract the public from what could arguably be the biggest story in the world? In searching for answers to this question, it turns out that evidence to suggest MI5 involvement has been around ever since the original Doug and Dave story broke back in 1991. As people are now beginning to realise that we live in an era of increasing censorship, fake news and open media bias, maybe now it's time to re-examine everything they have ever led us to believe concerning the crop circles. Just as Graham Hancock's highly successful Netflix documentary Ancient Apocalypse challenges the mainstream archaeologist's view and has finally shown the world that there are alternative explanations for the mysterious ancient monuments discovered around the world, maybe now an alternative explanation surrounding the crop circles can be laid out in front of the public, because the consequences for humanity of crop circles not being man-made are frankly huge. In the early days, from around 1979 to the late 1980s, there was no mention of crop circles being made by people. Instead, suggestions of whirlwinds and plasma vortexes put forward by serious academics such as Dr. Terence Meaden were amongst the most popular hypotheses.
I believe that vortices, masses of spinning air, especially if they're electrified, are able to account for all the properties of the circles that we've found so far.
Whilst these theories presented a reasonable explanation for simple, standalone circles, they didn't explain the volume of formations that were being discovered. This theory went on to find itself on even more shaky ground when trying to explain the precision of what became known as quintuplet-type formations. similar to 5 spots on a dice, but the central circle is always bigger. Then, in 1989, the whirlwind vortex theory completely fell apart when detailed geometric analysis revealed that quintuplets contained complex 5-fold geometry implicitly hidden within the design.
John Martineau's brilliant work on the hidden, implicit, constraining geometry of the pentagram in formations of the early 90s.
The following year, on July 12, 1990, Eastfield in Alton Barnes became the centre of worldwide attention, following the discovery of a huge pictogram-type formation. Literally thousands of people descended upon this small farming village to catch a glimpse of this enigmatic design emblazoned on the landscape, causing the roads around the area to become completely blocked by cars. But it didn't stop there. Formations continued to appear almost daily, and by the end of the 1990 season, a total of 81 crop formations had been recorded in England, a large percentage of which took on this new pictogram type design. Again, later research discovered that these pictograms also had hidden implicit geometry contained within their designs. Understanding that the formations were akin to puzzles which contained hidden geometric forms within them eventually became the primary line of inquiry for some researchers. With the ensuing mainstream media explosion and public interest in crop circles at a near fever pitch, the anticipation for the 1991 season was off the charts. The expectation for something spectacular happening was duly rewarded with the discovery of another 70 formations, including more pictograms, a perfect Mandelbrot set, and 2 other types of design which required decoding. One such formation was the enigmatic Barbary Castle triangle, which still has many researchers and geometers scratching their collective heads as to what it could mean to this day. The other design appeared to be a written script of some type, so the researcher Professor Gerald Hawkins decided to establish if it was. He enlisted the help of a team of linguists who, after scouring through all known text which resembled the formation, discovered that it was an obscure form of post-Augustan Latin, which translated as, "We oppose acts of craft and cunning."
There was a building sense of, there is something really quite extraordinary happening here. And these shapes are getting bigger, they're building up, and maybe, and this can only ever be speculation, somebody on high thinks we don't want the public getting too involved with things like this, and we don't want people getting frightened that maybe aliens are visiting, so maybe the best thing to do is to do something now which breaks the spell. And I think that was really the beginning of that. And then 1991 comes, and then we have some pretty extraordinary crop circles. And again, it looks like the interest is building. There's a little bit of cynicism now because of what had happened the year before. And then, of course, suddenly, when you get to the autumn, the September of 1991, it's almost as if somebody thought, we need to do a little bit more debunking here. Because that was when Doug and Dave, the 2 elderly gentlemen who suddenly announced to the world that they had made them all, appear.
The 1991 season ended on the 22nd of August with the public completely bewildered. Speculations were aplenty, and although no one really knew what was going on, there was a tangible feeling in the air that this could be an extraterrestrial contact. Then all hopes were dashed when, on the morning of the 9th September, the front page of the Today newspaper's headline read, "The Men Who Conned the World." The article identified 2 men who claimed that since 1979 they had been making all the crop circles on their way home from the pub as a prank to fool the UFO community.
I lived in Australia from 1958 to 66. And when I came home, during their time in Australia, there was a report in their newspapers of a circular depression in a grass field in Queensland. And they immediately called it a UFO nest. In other words, it was where a UFO had landed. I've always been a bit interested in UFOs and sightings and that sort of thing. But when I came home in '66, I met Dave, who was a fellow artist, and we used to go venture out on Friday evenings and have a chat about watercolours and things and have a pint of beer. And one evening, summer evening, we saw a cornfield, and I remarked to him about this. And I said, why don't we put a circular depression in this cornfield, the same as they had out in Australia? I said, the UFO Society here, which was at its height at the time, Warminster especially, I said, they will probably think that it is a UFO that had landed.
The notion that Doug and Dave had made these all as a joke just didn't sit with what we were seeing in the fields. I mean, just that July, we'd had this amazing formation at Barbary Castle. And it's triangular, it's got all these different components to it. It's clearly steeped in something, very deep. And you looked at Doug and Dave, and they were jolly chaps you'd have a laugh with down the pub and have a drink with, and it was all great fun. But you just simply could not associate them with the level of what was being displayed in the fields. And I do feel that that's something which was overlooked at the time.
The story was quickly picked up by almost all mainstream media outlets worldwide. Millions of people who previously had such high hopes that something world-changing was happening in the wheat fields of southern England were both shocked and disappointed. In the ensuing months, the revelations of these two old men become a regular fixture of headline news worldwide as they continued to give TV interviews and demonstrations showing how they had pulled the whole thing off with nothing more than ropes, boards and a piece of twisted wire attached to their baseball caps. With the amount and intensity of the media coverage that followed, and despite the many flaws in their testimony pointed out by researchers at the time, it was clear that journalists had accepted Doug and Dave's confession, informing the public that the whole crop circle phenomenon was nothing more than an elaborate hoax.
But now it seems it was all a hoax.
However, serious researchers at the time doubted this explanation and vowed to continue their work.
So what happens now then? Do you just dismiss the whole thing, or do you take it a bit further?
Oh, no, we're not going to dismiss it at all.
Now from Operation Blackbird in Wiltshire is Colin Andrews, who's coordinating the project. He's author of a book on corn circles and has studied the subject for 10 years. Mr. Andrews, first let's look at some of the possible causes. The most tantalizing prospect, I suppose, is flying saucers. Is there any evidence that they were caused by flying saucers?
There is evidence that we do have here a phenomenon which on occasions is associated with an airborne component. At night, often luminous, orange in colour.
What is the evidence then that the flying saucers might be involved?
Well, we have to be careful with the term. Flying saucers conjure up all sorts of connotations of little green men and so on. We're looking at an airborne component which is unidentified, and indeed many people in the vicinity of these markings here in Wiltshire and in Hampshire have conclusively seen airborne illuminated components at ground level.
You sound like you believe them.
Well, you cannot go on year after year disbelieving credible witnesses.
But with the mainstream media narrative firmly backing the man-made explanation, it soon became clear that these researchers were in for a rough time, not just with the media, but in the years that have followed with the general public too.
No fear of Martians up here or anything?
No,
like that?
I don't think so. No, probably a little bit further over towards Warminster.
Once the debunking began, of course, then we were on this slide into most people in the public being persuaded that it was all a big joke. And that was a shame, because that's never been shown, even to this day. Yes, some are man-made, absolutely, but all? And that's something which is still hanging, because I personally don't believe that the evidence points towards that for some. But that, of course, again, in itself creates great problems, because then you're left in this world of whatever you say, you will be attacked for it.
At the time, there were several researchers who claimed that this was a sophisticated debunking campaign involving high-level government officials. They suggested that the media, in collusion with the intelligence services, were putting a lid on the whole thing. Shortly before the release of Doug and Dave to the public, a CBS reporter was apparently warned by a French government scientist that the British government would soon present two people to the press as the makers of all crop circles. After the story broke during a lecture to the Foreign Press Association, the journalist Graham Brough was asked to explain a copyright line that appeared at the bottom of his original story, which read, "Today has paid no money. Copyright MBF Services." The nervous reporter explained that they had added the words as a joke. Of course, if this was true, it would seriously violate journalistic standards. Further inquiries were made with the deputy editor of Today newspaper, who added, "It's only an agency that we had checked the details for us. A totally independent press agency, nothing else. A freelance press agency. But they brought us in contact with these people, and hence they have the copyright."
One, though, of the mysteries of Doug and Dave was, even though they were chaps who would have just happily fronted this for a laugh anyway, that very word fronting suggests that maybe they were a front for something. And there were suspicions that, just as in what had happened at Bratton Castle the year before might have been a setup to discredit the phenomenon in the public mind, that this was part two of that, but on a much larger level. And George Wingfield, who at that stage was an open-minded researcher, he would become rather more sceptical as the years went by, but he did good work, decided to try to find out who had put out the Doug and Dave press release, because at the end of the story in the press, it said copyright MBF Services. But it gave the impression that that was some kind of press agency, but there was no press agency called MBF Services. And when George Wingfield tried to find it, couldn't find, there was basically no such entity. And the only MBF Services, or a company with MBF in it, that he could find that had any kind of sort of connection with Doug and Dave, he claimed was a company that had connections with MI5. Now, MI5 is, of course, our intelligence services here. So, proving that's another matter, but if that is true, that would suggest, as a number of people have felt over the years, that there was somebody on high trying to basically distract the public and make a joke of it, make a laugh of it, so that they would never again take it seriously. And you could argue that worked for a while, because certainly, for years to come, and even in more recent years, with Doug and Dave both dead, people would say, "Oh, it's those two old blokes, isn't it?" And the fact that that image of these two chaps having a laugh in a field with a plank of wood and a piece of string has stuck so much in the public mind is testament, to be fair, to the strength of that campaign. If it was a debunking campaign, it certainly worked. And it would be years before the level of interest would begin to build up again in quite the same way.
However, further investigation located the source of MBF Services with the information provided by a former member of MI5, a department of the British Secret Service.
I was involved with MI5 when we circulated disinformation around the world concerning the Northern Ireland conflict. For this purpose, we founded a seemingly private press agency on whose desks our own people sat.
Exhaustive searches were made to locate and speak to someone from MBF Services, but mysteriously, it wasn't even possible to find a telephone number for them.
Handing out a telephone number was to be avoided at all costs. If this proved impossible, a special number was arranged on the end of which one of our men sat.
When questioned, they refused to identify which of the formations they are responsible for, as this would open them up to prosecution for criminal damage, they say. Like Doug and Dave, though, they also claim that their primary motivation is to fool and deceive die-hard researchers and the public alike. However, despite repeated requests from researchers, these people refuse to provide accurate demonstrations to show us all how they pull off these impressive feats of design so flawlessly during the night. What we do see each year is a handful of individuals who provide paid publicity stunts for newspapers and TV shows. These activities always happen in broad daylight, and as we will show, these demonstrations always take many hours, even days to complete. One of the first public demonstrations of the making of a crop circle was carried out by 12 students from the University of Oregon, who were commissioned to make a crop circle of the logo from the internet search engine Firefox. We should mention that these individuals were not experienced crop circle makers of note, so in all fairness, we can't expect the final result to reflect what so-called seasoned circle makers can allegedly achieve. However, they did have the opportunity to carry out a practice run at a nearby field of grass just a couple of weeks before the main event. It should also be pointed out that they were not creating innovative, complex geometry, but were simply reproducing the Firefox logo, which already existed. Nonetheless, this enterprise does provide one of the very few documented examples of the whole process of making a crop circle from start to finish. And this affords us the opportunity to really compare the differences with crop circles that have appeared under far more mysterious circumstances. Having got permission from a farmer, the team walked out into a flat field of oats at 7:30 AM and began marking out the design with wooden stakes before commencing with flattening down the crop with boards and rope. Apart from a couple of refreshment breaks, they worked through until 2:30 AM in the early hours of Saturday morning. An important point to note here is that with the sun setting at around 8:30 PM, the last 6 or so hours of work was completed with the aid of torches and lamps.
It's getting dark out, so we're busting out the headlamps and we're going to start detailing the area.
This makes sense, of course, because these agricultural areas do not have any streetlights, so these locations are extremely dark at night. As you can see from the footage, this would cause anyone working under such conditions to become easily visible to anyone passing by in the surrounding area.
My blue line? Yeah.
They would also be heard by anyone who was close by.
The top ring is all done.
And by the top ring, you mean what?
There's a stake at each one of these points.
There's a stake at each one of the lines. We're now going
so we're
non-staking.
At one third the distance. Okay.
And yet, despite all this torchlight and noise going on all night, no one has ever been caught in the act of making a crop circle. Just think about that for a minute. Every year, for 40 years, huge crop circles appear in the same locations, quite often in the very same fields, and yet no one has ever been caught in the act. Is our police service so bad that they can't catch a bunch of vandals who show up in the same place every year for 40 years? Anyway, back to these students who've already put in a full day and still haven't finished. After 5 hours sleep, they returned at 7:30 AM and continued to stamp down the crop for another 3.5 hours until they completed the design at 11 AM. The actual construction, therefore, took 12 people 22.5 hours to complete, including refreshments and a sleep break. However, this demonstration gives us one of the very few examples of what 12 people can reasonably achieve when attempting to make a crop circle. It also gives us the opportunity to note the methods they use, together with a few other important factors. First of all, we saw that one member of the team remained outside the formation at all times, with a plan of the design laid out in front of him. He remained in constant radio contact with the team doing the work, directing them and marking off completed areas on a map he had in front of him as they went along.
West, 123 degrees.
This makes sense, of course, as we would expect to have a base of operations with someone overseeing the project from outside. Photographs also showed that another member of the team was perched on a tall ladder, giving him a higher perspective so that he could guide the other members of the team whilst they flattened the crop. It was also noted that they had the benefit of a pilot with a light aircraft who periodically flew over the field to check progress. Each time he landed, he would show the team aerial pictures from which they could correct any mistakes.
It looks good from up there.
Right? Like just the end of the tail, because
yeah, we could thicken. Did we do that? You guys, they sort of did that. Maybe we didn't finish.
So let's recap. The finished design measured approximately 200 feet or 65 meters in diameter. The whole process, which included scouting locations, completing the plan and having a practice run, was all carried out over a 2-week period. The actual making of the formation from start to finish, including rest breaks, took 12 people, 22.5 hours. They worked out in the open for all to see during the day, with friends and family driving up to bring them food and refreshments. They had the benefit of a pilot and an aeroplane who took pictures to help them keep on track. At night, they wore head torches and talked loudly on their radios. It's fair to say that looking down from above, the finished result looked like a crop circle. However, what you see on the ground tells a very different story. Just one look at the damage done to the flattened crop clearly demonstrates what 22.5 hours of stomping down fragile crop with boards will achieve. To say that this process left the plants in a seriously damaged condition would be an understatement. The flattened crop looks more like wood shavings on the floor of a carpenter's workshop. This just doesn't compare to the completely undamaged crops recorded over and over again in the vast majority of crop circles. This is one of the key problems which constantly gets overlooked, and yet it's staring everyone right in the face. How do you flatten crops with boards and rope without damaging it?
And of course, there's all the other evidence which Doug and Dave types, and even some of the more sophisticated circle makers, human ones who've come along since, they don't address, which is you have a weaving and a layered quality to a lot of this crop, which we don't seem to see in their creations when people make them. You have all the biological anomaly work that was carried out by people like the late William Levengood and others, which did, to me, seem credible, that there were biological changes occurring in the plants and chemical changes occurring in the soil that you just don't get from man-made formations.
And he pulverizes the dirt and then runs it through various grates, and with very strong magnets draws out the magnetic particles, weighs them, well, weighs the whole soil sample first, then weighs the amount of particles, so we know how many particles per gram of soil. Then, once we've done that, extracted them, we send them off to the West Coast to a mineralogist who does SEMEDS. And the idea then is to determine what they're made of. The soil work indicates the presence of a magnetic iron, tiny little spherules of magnetic iron. And it's not only their presence which is of interest, it's the manner in which they're distributed. Frequently around the periphery of these circles, sometimes distributed linearly, indicating a delivery system that's fairly sophisticated.
In the next example, we'll take a closer look at the construction of a larger formation commissioned by the Japanese beer company Asahi in what they publicised as a $1 million advertising campaign. For this project, they hired a team of 40 professionals to construct the formation, including surveyors, drone operators, and a whole host of experienced land workers. On the first day, lead surveyor Adam Nicholson got his first taste of the scale of the epic job at hand. He commented, "When you see a 750 by 350 metre field that has to be filled with letters, daunting would probably be an understatement." The design itself was projected onto the field using state-of-the-art GPS equipment provided by a UK company called Mazescape. This technology enabled ground workers to walk around with sophisticated instruments that informed them where to hammer in the necessary marker posts. In addition, they sprayed bright pink paint every 2 meters to mark out the lines and curves of this giant logo. And by the time they'd finished, they managed to get through 48 cans of the stuff. Tractors, drum rollers and petrol-powered bush cutters were used to actually cut out the design. Traditional stomper boards, the tools used by known circle makers, were only used on the smaller elements. Nicholson said that the most difficult part was the Japanese symbols, with each one taking around half a day to complete. He commented that there were often funny scenes when groundsmen ran out of paint or wanted lunch, causing them to have to retrace their steps through 4 or 5 letters in order to get out without damaging the standing crop. You felt like you were in a maze, Nicholson said. All in all, the task of cutting out the design took 1 whole week to complete. This was with a total of 40 men working from dawn till dusk. The final cost is not known, but the production company's budget was $1 million. ABC journalist Kate Hill reported on the event, remarking on the amount of time, effort and cost of the enterprise compared with what we regularly see being achieved in just a few hours of darkness in the UK. And all these, of course, are done for free. The only journalist, to my mind, who's ever really made proper comments on what's going on with the crop circles was Kate Hill of ABC News in Australia, who got involved in the promotional campaign that ASHA-EB had put on. And she drew a comparison between what it took those guys to actually pull off this feat of making this crop circle compared to the large proportion of crop circles that we see appear around the world in a few hours of darkness.
Because it does seem to be somebody shows a formation is man-made and they go, well, there you go. That explains everything, but it doesn't. You can do different things, right, in different ways. Just because somebody's shown you that here's one way to achieve it doesn't mean that that's how all of these are achieved. And then you look at all the other things, never mind the eyewitness sightings, people who've watched these things occurring within seconds in front of their eyes, or they've seen the lights coming down from the sky into the fields, never mind all that. There's just so much that is not explained if you say that every single crop circle ever was man-made. And the evidence is not there to support that claim.
These 2 examples provide us with enough data to compare them with other crop circles which are known to have appeared in just a few hours of darkness. Let's take a look at a couple of these and draw a direct comparison. On the 7th of July 2007, myself, Paula Presley-Jones and Winston Keach conducted a night vigil overlooking Eastfield in Alton Barnes, Wiltshire. But little did we know that what would happen that night would change our lives forever.
In the morning, about 1:30 a.m, we arrived here on Knapp Hill to begin a night vigil overlooking Eastfield here in the background. When we got here, we met up with a cameraman called Wynne, who had a set of cameras set up here on the hill and also some cameras set up on his vehicle which he brought through into the field down below. He showed us, when we got here, he showed us an image intensifier device that he had, and we scanned across the field. It was like looking at the field in sort of daylight, you know, it brought in more light. And we scanned across Eastfield and across the field of rape here and the Drovers Road and this field of wheat here, and we could see that there was no formations in the field at that time. Then we sat here then just talking and overlooking the field until about 3 o'clock. Just after 3 o'clock we had a big white flash of light that completely encompassed the landscape and the sky. It was around that time that Wynne had to go down to his vehicle to change the tapes over. So he went down and done that and came back up to the hill. And at that point in the evening it was completely dark. What we were looking down on was a completely black field. We couldn't see anything at that point. About 20 minutes after that, as some of the light began to creep in from the east over there, we started to see a shadow of what looked like some sort of formation down below, but it was still too imperceptible really for the naked eye to see. So Wynne got up and looked through his camera, which has an image enhancing kind of capability, and through the lens of the camera we could clearly see this formation that was laid out here in the field before us. So So at the point of seeing that on that camera and the point of realising that this may be something that people might sit up and take notice finally, I was just jumping for joy, and I still am.
Yeah, big night for me anyway, and the two other people that were with me. It's funny, isn't it, how you can look back even 15 years later. I still get a little bit of a tingle really thinking about what happened to us that night, and you know, I've come to realise over the years that, you know, skepticism, people not believing my version of what happened, or that it happened in front of us, or whatever they want to believe, you know, it's totally normal. They weren't there, you know, I was, and it's been a journey for me just to come to terms with the fact that I had this experience, and it's fine that other people don't believe it or are uncomfortable with it or whatever. To ground it in myself, to know that it happened, to know that what took place in front of us was indeed miraculous, that's enough for me. You know, my point has been all along that if you've got 150 circles which you know appeared in under 300 minutes of darkness, complete darkness, whilst that field's being video recorded on two separate cameras throughout the night, to prove that there was nothing there before, and that in that duration of time and working conditions, a big crop circle consisting of 150 circles appeared, then you can do the simple sums. It's 1 every 2 minutes. It's actually it's less than 2 minutes, but just rounding it up to 300 minutes, 5 hours, it's 1 every 2 minutes. Without 3 people detecting it, who were sitting, you know, on top of the hill, no noise, no light source, no nothing. Compare this to the known examples that we have of people making crop circles, and this just doesn't happen. They need torches, they need aeroplanes to fly around and tell them what to do, they need GPS equipment, they need paint markers and stakes and ropes and cutting equipment and land surveyors, and it just doesn't happen in under 300 minutes in the darkness. It doesn't happen. Despite the age-old saying that lightning doesn't strike in the same place twice, the following year, on the 8th of August 2008, 888, due to popular demand, I organised another night watch, but this time around 200 people showed up. People were spread out to keep watch all across Knapp Hill and the neighbouring Milk Hill, and no one witnessed any human activity in the fields. However, to everyone's surprise, at first light, another huge formation was discovered beneath Milk Hill, right under everyone's noses. Unbelievably, despite all the 200 people present, none of whom saw anyone making a crop circle, the event went totally unreported. The mainstream media never printed a word about it, and if you search for it on YouTube, you won't find any reference to it at all. But it doesn't stop there. Other examples just boggle the mind when we consider the same parameters of time frame and nocturnal working conditions. Back in 1996, a spectacular formation appeared at Windmill Hill, Wiltshire, containing over 196 individual circles and spanning over 800 feet in diameter. At ground level, it's impossible to comprehend what on earth you are standing in. It's only when you stand in it and simultaneously look at an aerial picture that you get that mind-blowing experience. But when we're talking about huge crop circles appearing in just a few hours of darkness, then first prize goes to the Milk Hill formation of 2001, where one of the biggest geometrical formations ever to appear in the UK was discovered on the morning of the 12th of August. Covering over 65,000 square metres and comprising 409 circles of varying sizes, this formation once again appeared in just 4 to 5 hours of darkness. In addition, locals testified that the weather on the Saturday night before the formation's discovery was the worst downpour of rain seen all summer, and it rained all night long.
If you look at the Milk Hill Formation, they only had 4 hours of night, I should say, and it was raining. Now, when I went in it first thing in the morning, there was no sign of any mud on the stalks. They were dead flat, and it was very, very meticulous, and there's no way you could put that pattern down in 4 hours of darkness. Now, I know for a fact that night there were people on the hill, and to make something that big, you would have had to have made a certain amount of noise, and nobody heard anything or saw anything.
The number of circles constructed in 4 to 5 hours means that each of them would have to have been created in around 45 seconds, something which any reasonable person would see is completely impossible. Despite this, an anonymous testimony was published claiming that 13 people took just 6 hours to construct the whole formation. This anonymous individual also claimed that the different sized circles were made using a rope and knots system. No evidence was ever provided to substantiate this claim, just simply the anonymous testimony itself. Given the examples of known man-made formations that we've seen, the question everyone needs to ask themselves is how on earth would it be possible that just 13 people could make such a complex formation in just 4 to 5 hours of darkness in the pouring rain, compared to 40 professionals who took a whole week working from dawn till dusk to make the Ashai beer logo. And let's not forget that in addition to working in daylight hours, these professionals also had the benefits of modern technology using sophisticated GPS locators and drones, tractors and bush cutters, as well as numerous cans of pink spray paint.
If you have enough time, usually days, and you lay it all out with GPS devices, and you can make some quite nice patterns in the field. Even some very complex artworks have been created. We know that. But the trouble is, so many crop circles have occurred in very short periods of time, often in daylight, often in very public spaces next to famously places like Stonehenge, but other ones where we know there was nothing there in the field for most of the day, then suddenly that is there. And you look at how long it takes just to construct these on paper, even on a computer screen, right? And then to get the precision you need to lay that out. And that can take you hours on a sheet of A4 paper, let alone laying that out in a pitch dark field at night. In a way, it's the time factor that's the most important thing here. That some of these huge formations and complex have occurred in very short windows of time. So yes, right, you can have a counterfeit coin, but that doesn't mean you throw all your money in the bin, does it?
If this isn't enough to raise any doubt about the man-made explanation, then just challenge yourself to draw it on paper in under 5 hours. But you must do it from start to finish without making any mistakes, just like the vast majority of highly complex geometrical crop circles we find year after year. This is another factor which always gets overlooked. 99% of crop circles are always perfect, with many of them containing even more complex geometry hidden within them. When you think about it though, they must be executed perfectly the first time, because once you crush wheat down with boards and rope, you can't stand it back up again if you make a mistake. And so, why is it so accepted that these people make these crop circles when they've never demonstrated that they can? I've said it many times, if Michelangelo walked out of the Sistine Chapel with a pencil behind his ear and said, I did that last night in the dark. What else can you say, really? It's strange. The real question is why so-called investigative journalists are so ready to accept the words of a handful of individuals who say they make all the crop circles when a simple calculation of the numbers reveals these claims to be quite ridiculous. No one disputes that it's possible to go into a field and trample down crops. Every year we see the low quality results of these efforts, which often take many hours, even days to complete. Clearly the general public's never shown a graphic side-by-side comparison comparing these pitiful attempts at recreating what is clearly a far superior art form. If any of this has given you pause to reconsider the crop circle phenomenon, then you may wonder, well, if people aren't making them, then who is and why?